How do you define success? How do you measure it? What is the metric you use to determine whether or not you are living a successful life? Everyone has an opinion about it. I mean, some famous people have expressed their opinion about what success is. Famously, General George Patton, the cantankerous commander from World War II, said, "Success is how high you bounce when you hit bottom." John Paul Getty, the oil billionaire, said, "My formula for success is rise early, work late, and strike oil." Winston Churchill said, "Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." The famously optimistic Zig Ziglar said, "Success is dependent upon the glands, sweat glands." And Woody Allen said 80% of success is showing up. Now, you may agree with them, you may not. I think we all have opinions about it. That's what makes the definition of success so hard to come by, because it is a relative thing. It is a subjective thing. It is most commonly measured in comparison. We measure ourselves as successful when we look at how far we have come or the things we have overcome. And success for one person may not be success for another. If I compare my life to the life of someone who is living in Aleppo, Syria, my life is wildly successful. For their metric for success may be simple survival. My measure of success involves a Maserati. And so we have different levels of success, and it makes it difficult for us to settle on an idea that we would all agree is a measure of true success. Let me kind of test a theory I have to find out how we define success. And I need you to be courageous and honest. And I need you, with a show of hands, honestly, how many of you believe that your life is very successful? Show of hands. What would you guess that is? 40%? 50% of the people that are here? Now compare that to answer honestly this question. How many of you would like for your life to be more successful? Okay. Everybody who raised their hand before raised their hand again. So the pursuit of success, we typically establish a metric that looks something like this. If this is money and this is fame, then success looks like more of all of that. Well, I want to suggest that there is a different metric, that our lives can be guided by a very different measure that measures success not by the hockey stick, but measures success by this trajectory. What I want to spend the next few weeks talking about is how do we fall into greatness? How do we find freedom, not just in success, but from success? But before we talk about that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to fall into a place where we find true success. Pray that we would have the courage to make that leap. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. I like to imagine that they were born around the same time. We have no historical evidence that says that the two of them were born in the same year, but I like to imagine that that would be cool if they were. Even though they lived very, very different lives, they had very much in common. And while we don't know when one of them was born, we know that both of them were born to parents who were refugees. They were parents who were fleeing the oppressive government in their homeland. One of them, his family, was fleeing their native home because of the needs of a census and taxation. Eventually, they left their country altogether and hid in Egypt because of the political oppression. The other individual, his family had left perhaps a generation before, fleeing the political oppression and settling hundreds of miles from their native land. It was where he was raised, in an area that we now call southern Turkey, in a village called Tarsus. The two of them lived very different lives. One lived in a working class family, a family of very meager means. The other lived a life of privilege, a life of influence. Even though these were expatriate people, they were people in their community who had a great deal of influence, perhaps wealth. They were considered citizens of the empire. Both of these young men were identified as potential rabbis, scholars in their faith, and they both were educated in that faith. One of them was educated in an informal way. The other was educated quite formally, which meant that at the age of 5, as soon as he could begin to read, he would be taught the language of his forefathers. He would be taught Hebrew and Aramaic. He would be expected to be conversant in the language of the culture, which at the time was Koine Greek. He was, as a young child, encouraged to memorize large passages of the Torah and the Talmud and the writing of the rabbinic fathers, so that at the age of 10, he would be confirmed as a son of the law at his bar mitzvah. This particular individual, when he was about 13 years old, was sent to boarding school hundreds of miles away in the capital of his nation, in Jerusalem, where he studied at the feet of one of the greatest theological and legal minds of his day, a man named Gamaliel. Throughout the course of their life, they increased in wisdom, but one remained in obscurity. The other returned home to his birthplace in Turkey, in Tarsus, and there he established his reputation as a teacher of the law, as an influential Jewish rabbi, and he gained influence and popularity even at a young age. He was welcomed into the leadership, the sort of the bar of Judaism called the Pharisees. And he was a respected and influential up-and-comer in his city and in his faith. One of them was named for a vision that his father was given, named after one of the greats of Israel, Yeshua. He was known as Yeshua of Nazareth. The other was named for the first king of Israel, Saul, and he was known as Saul of Tarsus. Yeshua of Nazareth went on to begin, over the course of just barely 3 years, a movement which would change the course of human history. The other, Saul of Tarsus, sought with all of his might to destroy that movement. He describes himself like this: "We have no confidence in human effort, though I could have confidence in my own effort if anyone could. Indeed, if others have reason for confidence in their own efforts, I have even more. I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I am a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew of Hebrews, if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees, who demand the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so zealous that I harshly persecuted the church, and as for righteousness, I obeyed the law without fault." Saul of Tarsus was a man who measured success by the accumulation of his own righteousness, by his own self-determined path, that he was representing the accomplishments that made him successful through his own efforts. He was a man of self-determination and self-righteousness. But there was a point in his life where everything changed, and his paradigm for success went from a trajectory that went up to a trajectory that went down. He went from ascending into success to descending into greatness. Over the next 3 weeks, I want us to follow that trajectory. I want us to follow the path that the Apostle Paul, the converted Saul of Tarsus, was on. And there are markers of this path in his writings. It was in the year 52 AD that the Apostle Paul set out from Syrian Antioch, which was his spiritual home base, on what would be his first missionary journey. He took about a year going through the villages of central Turkey and into the regions called Galatia. He wound up at the church in Ephesus, in western Turkey, where he stayed and served as the pastor there for over 2 years. During his time in Ephesus, near the time when he left, sometime in the fall or the spring of 56 AD, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter, which is preserved for us, a letter to the highly dysfunctional church on the Isthmus of Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul describes for us the trajectory that he has begun to follow. A man who was the best of the best, a man who measured success by his own righteousness and his own self-determination, now describes himself as the least of the apostles. This trajectory began and it marked a descent into greatness, but it continued from there. It was 4.5 years later when the Apostle Paul found himself under house arrest in Rome from 62 to 64 AD. The Apostle Paul was in prison in Rome. And when he was in prison in Rome, he wrote a letter back to the church in Ephesus. And it's there that he describes himself not as the least of the apostles, not as the least of the best, but as the least of the rest. He describes himself as the least of God's people. His descent continued from the self-righteous Pharisee to the least of the best, to the least of the rest, and his journey continued to the end of his life. In the chapters of his life that are not recorded in the book of Acts, in the period after his release from prison in Rome, it's speculated that he lived in the area of Macedonia and worked in the churches in Philippi and Colossae. For a number of years, he worked there until he was arrested again in 67 AD and eventually executed in Rome. But it was during this time, in the mid-60s, probably 64 AD or so, that he wrote to his protege Timothy, who was the pastor in the church in Ephesus. And he doesn't describe himself as the self-righteous Pharisee or as the least of the best or the least of the rest. He describes himself in 1 Timothy chapter 1 as the worst of the worst. A true saying that is worthy of acceptance, he says. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of which I am the worst. He goes on in verse 16 to describe himself as the chief of sinners. The Apostle Paul was descending into greatness, and it began here. It began on a road, on a journey from Jerusalem to Damascus, probably in 34 AD, probably within a year after the resurrection. The Apostle Paul was on his way to round up the renegade followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And on his way there, his journey, his trajectory of success was interrupted. And it was interrupted, and his life was changed from that moment on. All of us have a similar story. All of us find ourselves trying to bring order to our lives, trying to make sense of who we are and what we are capable of. We establish expectations and we establish hopes and dreams and pursuits and disciplines, and we begin, if we are fortunate, to order our lives. But then our lives are interrupted. and disorder comes into our life. Sometimes it's in the form of tragedy. Sometimes it is in the form of catastrophe. Sometimes it's in the form of failure. Sometimes it's in the form of loss. Sometimes it is a simple pothole in the road, and other times it is a terminal diagnosis. But all of us on the trajectory of our life come to a place of disorder, a place that, if you are familiar with recovery language, finds us at rock bottom, finds us at the end of our rope, finds us in the dark night of our soul, finds us reflecting on our life and wondering, how did we get here? And it's at this point that we have a choice. In this Damascus Road moment in all of our lives, and many times these are informal invitations. Sometimes they are tragically formal feelings of loss and feelings of failure. Sometimes they are just the gentle reminder that you can't do this alone. And that is the choice we have. At this point of disorder, all of us have a choice. And the choice is to continue on our own, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to set our face into the wind, and to press on, and to not give up, and to continue on our path of pursuing success with our own self-reliance and our own self-determination and our own self-righteousness. Or it's at these points of disorder that we can change the measure, we can change the metric, and we can fall into the arms of a loving God, and we can say, I have no desire to do this on my own. I have no capacity to order the chaos that is the world that I live in. I need your help. I want your companionship. And it's at this point that our journey follows the path of the Apostle Paul. From the self-righteous one to the humble least of the best. And for this journey to begin, to take place in our life, we have to reorder our priorities, reorder our expectations, reorder our souls. And there's two things that have to take place if we are going to begin this descent into greatness. And the first one is that we have to take a relentless interrogation of our souls. And we have to have a ruthless investigation, a ruthless spiritual inventory. We all do it. We may not realize that we do it. Because when we come to these points of disorder, no matter how great or how small, we all ask the same question. We all ask the same question in those moments of grief and loss. At that road to Damascus opportunity, this is the question everyone asks. Why? Why? Why me? Why now? Why this? Why not? Why did this happen? Why did God allow this? Why? And it's the right question. It's just pointed in the wrong direction. The question we need to ask is, why does it hurt so much? Why do I need this success so badly that the loss of it brings me such pain? Why do I feel the loss and the grief and the wounds? Why is my soul so ruined? Why do I feel so lost? This ruthless spiritual interrogation, this investigation of our souls is the opportunity that we have when our lives fall into disorder to say, why? What is it about me? How am I fashioned? Who am I in my soul? Why does it feel the way that it feels to me? And it's through this ruthless spiritual interrogation that we begin to understand who we are and what success looks like for us. Now, this is an unpleasant thing. This is hard work. I would not recommend that you do it alone. I would not recommend that you do it without wise counsel, without good advice, without loving people around you, without those who will be honest with you, without skilled counselors, without God's word speaking into your life. Find all the help that you can get during these seasons of ruthless spiritual interrogation. That's why it is provoked by tragedy, because most of us would not invite ourselves into such examination. That's why it is so often associated with grief and loss and pain and frustration. It's at that point that we are invited to take inventory. But there's a second thing that is required if we are going to make this first leg of our descent into greatness, and that is simply this: it's time. It takes time. There are no shortcuts. There are no microwave versions of this. Now, for some it takes longer than others. Some of us have thicker heads. Some of us require larger blocks of wood to fall on our face. Some of us are more stubborn, but some of us are more open. But it all takes time. We know that time can heal even the deepest wounds, that time can change our perspective, and it takes time to reorder our lives. For some of us, it takes a lifetime. For the Apostle Paul, it took years. After his conversion experience on the road to Damascus, the next 3 years of his life, he remained in Damascus, and he also lived in Arabia. And as far as we can tell, he told everyone and anyone about what had happened to him on the road to Damascus. He was zealous, and he was enthusiastic. He was confrontational. He was all worked up about how his life had been changed, and he believed everyone's life it could be changed the same way as his. Have you ever known anyone like that? Who has a spiritually transforming experience and they become obnoxious? They become the person who wears everyone out about this new discovery? That was Paul. That was me. If you have ever met anybody like that, get to know me. And you will know that obnoxious zeal that comes with that transforming experience, with the discovery of a new hope. And for 3 years, the Apostle Paul kind of spun in his own universe in the area of Damascus and Arabia. And then he ran into a man named Barnabas. And Barnabas said, you should meet the founders of the faith. You should meet the people who actually knew Jesus. And he took him to Jerusalem in 37 AD, and there he appeared before the core of the early church, the apostles. And they realized that this one who had been persecuting the church had been transformed. And so they sent him home to Tarsus. And he was in Tarsus for 11 years, studying and learning and teaching and sharing. We know nothing of the fruitfulness of his activity. We just know that it took time. It took 14 years for Saul of Tarsus to be ready to become Paul, the least of the apostles. It takes time. It takes time for all of us, and we are an impatient lot. His story is our story. And like him, we long for that transformational experience. But unlike him, we expect it to happen instantaneously. In fact, I have noticed in my experience in studying the history of the church that in the last 3/4 of the century, American evangelical Christianity has codified this moment and said, this is the moment that matters. We've attached language to it. We talk about this moment being the moment of belief, the moment of conversion, the moment you get born again, the moment you get saved. And we have so identified that moment that we have said, this is the most important thing that you can do in your spiritual journey. And there's no doubt that it is a significant transforming moment to respond to the invitation to trust in Christ as a reliable Savior is no doubt a moment that can change the trajectory of our lives. But it is not a moment that is meant to begin and end there. Have you ever known anyone who at some point in their life, and perhaps in some crisis or in their vulnerability, made a profession of faith and expressed a desire to live a transformed life, and then you see them later, years down the road, And you see no evidence that this transformation ever took place? It's like a person who goes into a bike shop and buys a bicycle. Said, I want that bike. And they buy the bike and they leave it in the bike shop. And they never ride it. Maybe they ride it around in the shop, but they never take it out of the shop. Now it's their bike. It's their bike forever. Has their name on it. That bike was paid for them. But it's a bike that was meant to be ridden. It was meant to take you somewhere. It wasn't just meant to sit in the shop. And you see that person and you see them and they say to you, I'm a bicyclist. And you go, really? You're fat and lazy. How is it that you're a bicyclist? I see no evidence of fitness. I see no evidence of training. I see no evidence that you actually ride a bike. Oh, well, I have a bike. It's back in the shop. See, the invitation is to trust. And the watershed of that transforming moment is that we reorder our lives, that we begin the process of reevaluating, of reordering our lives. This is what happened to the Apostle Paul. This is what happened to him on the road to Damascus as he traveled from Jerusalem to Damascus. And God interrupted his journey. And he sent him on a trajectory not to accumulate success, but to descend into greatness. His story is not that different than ours. It's a story that the Apostle Paul describes in the book of Acts. He said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. I was brought up and educated here in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. As his student, I was carefully trained in our Jewish laws and custom. I became very zealous to honor God in everything I did, just like all of you today. And I persecuted the followers of the way, hounding some to death, arresting both men and women, and throwing them in prison. The high priest and the whole council of elders can testify that this is so. For I received letters from them to our Jewish brothers in Damascus, authorizing me to bring the followers of the way there to Jerusalem in chains to be punished. As I was on the road approaching Damascus about noon, a very bright light from heaven suddenly shone down around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. And the voice replied, I am Jesus the Nazarene, the one you are persecuting. I like to imagine that Paul and Jesus grew up in the same time frame, but there is no evidence to suggest that their paths ever crossed. Saul lived his life in southern Turkey and Tarsus. Jesus lived his life in the regions of Judea and Galilee. He may have heard of this young rabbi, but it wasn't until after the resurrection, when the movement of his followers began to gain notoriety, that the notice was given by Saul of Tarsus to the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. But the two of them did meet on the road to Damascus. And they met in the same way that many of us meet him. When God interrupts our agenda and our expectations and takes the order we are seeking to establish in our life and turns it upside down and turns it into disorder and invites us in to fall into his arms, to reorder our lives, to redefine how we measure success. So how do you measure success? Do you measure success by how you dress? Do you dress for success? Because I do. This is my success suit. This is the suit that I bought that brought me success. It was in the year 2005, and I was a candidate to become the pastor of Riverbend Church. And I went to a clothing store in San Francisco, and I paid the most for any suit I had ever paid for in my life. This is the suit, and this is the job it got me. I would say this is a successful suit. But how do you define success? That chronic and professional pessimist named Friedrich Nietzsche said success has always been a great liar. It was Albert Einstein who said, try not to become a man of success, but rather to become a man of value. It was Warren Buffett, a man who knows a thing or two about success, said success only requires us to do a few things right in our life, so long as we don't do too many things wrong. Mark Twain said, let us be thankful for the fools, but for them the rest of us could not succeed. And it was Ann Landers who said, the Lord gave us two ends, one to sit on and the other to think with. Success depends on which one you use the most. And then there was the definition of success from a young Galilean rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth, who said, the greatest among you will be your servant, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. How do you define success? Lord, I would ask that as we consider the courage to abandon ourselves into your care, to fall freely into your arms, and trust that our lives will matter in you, and that we can choose a different path, descending into greatness. Pray that we'd at least have the courage to consider that, and that you would give us the faith to follow that path. I ask this for myself and for my family and for all of us here. And I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.